7 friends got into their cars and drove to a quiet yet popular destination known as the Gapyeong River Valley. The area was famous for its beautiful waterfalls, crystal-clear pools, and towering cliffs that visitors often jumped from into the water below. That was exactly what the group had come to do. Since the drive from Seoul took about an hour, they arrived well after noon. They spent the afternoon swimming and eating fresh fruit. Eventually the sun set, evening fell, and it was time to head home. But someone suggested making one final jump from the cliff before leaving. One couple declined. They were cold and decided to wait for the others in their car at the parking lot. The remaining 5 friends stayed behind. The young men climbed to the top of the cliff and began jumping into the water one after another, while the women waited on the shore. 3 men jumped, but only 2 resurfaced. The oldest of the group, Yoon Sang-yup, never came back up. The men immediately dove in to search for him while the women threw a life ring into the water. It was all in vain. By the time rescuers arrived, they could only confirm with regret that what had begun as a wonderful day in the Gapyeong River Valley had ended in tragedy. Sometime later, 28-year-old Lee Yoon-hae, Yoon's wife, contacted SBS, one of South Korea's largest and most influential broadcasting companies. She desperately needed their help. Lee explained that her husband had died tragically in the Gapyeong River Valley. Since then, both her life and the lives of her daughter and parents had fallen apart because the insurance company had refused to pay out her husband's life insurance policy. Fighting back tears, Lee said that she and Yoon had married in 2016 after dating for 4 years. She described him as her best friend, her greatest source of support, and the rock she could always rely on. According to Lee, her parents were unable to work, and Yoon had worked tirelessly to support them as well. The young couple sent nearly all of their money to her parents. Sometimes they could not even afford a package of instant ramen from a nearby convenience store or replace their worn-out shoes. Yet they never complained, because they had each other. Yoon was also a very responsible man. From the moment they married, he made sure to pay his insurance premiums regularly. But after his death, the insurance company refused to pay his widow, claiming they suspected insurance fraud. Lee couldn't understand the accusation. How could she possibly have staged such a scheme when her husband had died after voluntarily jumping from a cliff? He had been the last to jump. No one had pushed him, and several witnesses had seen exactly what happened. The police had ruled the incident a tragic accident. So why, she asked, was the insurance company effectively leaving her family homeless? The television network sympathized with Lee. Reporters became interested in her story and decided to produce an episode exposing what they believed were the unfair practices of insurance companies, how they allegedly exploited grieving families who could not afford legal representation. The producers promised Lee they would help uncover the truth. On October 17, 2020, a new episode of the investigative television program I Want to Know aired under the title The Last Jump of the Day, The Mystery of the Death in the Gapyeong River Valley. However, instead of exposing corruption within the insurance industry, the journalists focused on the events leading up to Yoon's death and on the increasingly suspicious behavior of his wife, Lee. 7 people had traveled to the river that day, but not everyone knew each other. In fact, the one person connecting the entire group was Lee. She had come to the river with her lover, Cho Hyun-soo, her former lover, Kwon, and her husband, Yoon, whom she introduced merely as an older friend. Technically, that description wasn't false. Yoon was indeed 11 years older than Lee. He was 39 while she was 28, roughly the same age as everyone else in the group. But he wasn't simply an older friend. He was her husband. So Lee had gone on a day trip with her husband, her current lover, and her former lover. Her friends did not learn that Yoon was actually her husband until long after his death. Perhaps sensing how awkward the group's dynamics might be, Lee invited a school friend and her boyfriend to join them. Meanwhile, Kwon, Lee's ex-lover, brought along his own girlfriend, Choi, who had no idea that Lee and Kwon had once been in a relationship, or that they might even still have been seeing each other behind her back. The unusual group arrived at the waterfall around midday. Just as Lee had described, they spent hours swimming, jumping from the cliffs into the water, and eating watermelon, but not everyone seemed to be enjoying the outing. Lee and her friends repeatedly singled Yoon out for ridicule. To begin with, they had forgotten to bring a knife. or perhaps they had intentionally left it behind. The truth remains unclear. Either way, they were now faced with a problem. How were they supposed to cut open the watermelon? Most groups of close friends would probably have found a practical solution. Lee's friends came up with a very different idea. Someone should break the watermelon open with their head. 7 adults played a game of rock, paper, scissors to decide who would do it. Lee lost, but unsurprisingly, she had no intention of following through. Instead, her older friend volunteered to take her place. Cho held the watermelon while Yoon, encouraged by his wife and the others, repeatedly slammed his head into it. The entire incident was recorded on video. The footage shows Yoon stopping after each impact and clutching his head in pain. It is worth noting that the force required to crack a watermelon is surprisingly close to the limits of what the human skull can safely withstand. Beyond the risk of skull fractures, repeated impacts also place tremendous stress on the cervical spine. If the blow is not strong enough to break the watermelon, it can rebound like an elastic ball, transferring much of the impact force back into the person's head and significantly increasing the risk of serious injury. Somehow, Yoon eventually managed to crack the watermelon, but even then, he wasn't allowed to use his hands. The watermelon had to be split completely in half, so he kept hitting it with his head until the others declared the challenge complete. All of this took place while 6 adults laughed, cheered, and egged him on, and it was only the beginning. Afterward, everyone went back into the water. Yoon couldn't swim, so he planned to relax on an inflatable inner tube. Everyone in the group knew that he was unable to swim. Nevertheless, Cho and Kwon, Lee's current and former lovers, swam over to him and began pulling the tube toward the waterfall, where the water was roughly 3 meters deep. Once there, they started rocking it violently, clearly trying to flip it over. Lee watched from the shore, encouraging them. As with the watermelon incident, Yoon was obviously not enjoying himself. He repeatedly asked the men to stop and push their hands away from the tube. The women joined in as well. At one point, one of them shouted, "Shark!" frightening Yoon so badly that he covered his ears in panic. Some people might dismiss this as a group of friends fooling around and simply taking the joke too far. But this happened in South Korea, where age hierarchy and respect for elders are deeply ingrained cultural norms. Respect is expected not only toward elderly people, but also toward anyone even slightly older. Yoon was about 10 years older than everyone else in the group. Within that cultural context, treating him this way was considered especially disrespectful and completely unacceptable. Eventually, the day was drawing to a close. Night had fallen and the temperature had dropped. Lee's school friend and her boyfriend said they were cold and decided to wait in their car at the parking lot. The rest of the group also appeared ready to leave. Then Lee suggested making one last jump from the cliff. Notably, she had no intention of jumping herself. Cho and Kwon immediately supported the idea. Yoon did not. He had refused to jump earlier that day, even in broad daylight. He certainly had no desire to jump into dark water at night, especially considering that he couldn't swim. Kwon's girlfriend, Choi, also had no intention of jumping, but Lee kept pressuring Yoon. She refused to let the matter drop. Finally, she declared, "If you won't jump, then I will," as though someone absolutely pested to make the jump. But who, exactly? A group of people approaching 30 years old behaved more like cruel teenagers, relentlessly pressuring one man until he finally gave in. Yoon eventually agreed. In a group like this, he may have felt that he had little choice. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the 3 men climbed to the top of the cliff. The women remained on the shore watching, while the other couple had long since returned to their car to warm up. Cho carried the inflatable tube with him and tossed it into the water before diving headfirst. He surfaced safely. At first glance, it seemed as though he had thrown the tube into the water for Yoon to use. Instead, Cho climbed onto it himself and waited. Kwon jumped next. When he resurfaced, it was finally Yoon's turn. What happened next is known primarily from Choi's account, and her testimony differs from what the others later claimed. According to Choi, Yoon hesitated for a moment before jumping. He jumped voluntarily. No one pushed him. A few moments later, his head appeared above the surface. Although he couldn't swim, he wasn't screaming, calling for help, or panicking. Somehow he was managing to stay afloat. All 3 men were clearly visible above the water. They began slowly making their way toward the shore. Then something strange happened. Choi distinctly recalled seeing Cho make a hand gesture, as though signaling to someone. Before she had time to think about what the gesture might mean, Lee turned to her and asked for a cigarette. Choi looked away from the water for only a moment, just long enough to lean over, reach into her bag, and take out a cigarette. She suddenly heard a short, sharp cry. When she looked back, Yoon was struggling to stay afloat. He was clearly drowning. She couldn't understand what had happened. Just moments earlier, everything had seemed perfectly fine. Cho started swimming toward Yoon, but the inflatable tube around his body was obviously slowing him down. The two men were only about 9 meters apart. Under normal circumstances, it should have taken Cho no more than 20 seconds to cover that distance. Instead, he moved incredibly slowly. The tube seemed to leave him almost splashing in place rather than making real progress. Growing increasingly frustrated, Choi shouted at him to take the inflatable tube off. Cho finally listened. He removed it and threw it away. But instead of tossing it toward Yoon, he threw it farther away from both himself and the drowning man, even though he could easily have pushed it in Yoon's direction. At first glance, that might not seem important, since he should have reached Yoon within seconds anyway. But he continued swimming unusually slowly. To Choi, it felt as though she were watching a movie in slow motion. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. At that point, Lee suggested running to retrieve the life ring that was mounted on top of the cliff for visitors' safety. The women ran to get it, leaving them unable to see what was happening in the water. By the time they returned to the shore with the life ring, only about 2 minutes had passed. The surface of the water was perfectly still. Cho was standing near the bank, repeatedly saying, "I can't see him, I can't see him." Kwon confirmed that they had been unable to help Yoon. Choi called emergency services. Rescuers soon arrived, recovered Yoon from the water, and attempted CPR, but he could not be revived. Because Yoon had been spending the day with friends, had entered the water voluntarily, and there was no evidence that anyone had pushed him, the police concluded that his death was a tragic accident. Until Lee contacted SBS asking for help obtaining the insurance payout, no one, not even Yoon's family, had expressed any suspicions about the circumstances surrounding his death. The only exception was the insurance company. However, once SBS journalists began investigating the case, they uncovered information that came as a complete shock to Yoon's relatives. First, they learned that Yoon had apparently never even lived in the newlywed apartment he had rented several years earlier. Instead, he had been paying for an apartment where his wife lived with whichever boyfriend she happened to be dating at the time. According to the investigation, when Lee and Yoon got married, she insisted from the very beginning that they maintain 2 separate residences. Yoon worked in Suwon, about 19 miles south of Seoul. Lee, however, flatly refused to move there. She wanted to live in Incheon, a city bordering Seoul. As a result, Yoon was persuaded to pay the deposit for an expensive apartment in Incheon, while he himself lived alone in a tiny semi-basement room near his workplace in Suwon. Semi-basement apartments in South Korea were never originally intended as homes. They were constructed as civil defense shelters in the event of war. However, the country's housing shortage eventually led the government to permit them to be rented as residential units. They are often associated with numerous problems. They can flood during the rainy season, are vulnerable to insects and rodents, and easily accumulate dust, dirt, and pollen. They tend to be cold in winter and damp in summer, while the small windows often cannot be left open because of rats. Perhaps most notoriously, many residents describe a persistent musty odor that can cling to clothing. Anyone who has seen the Academy Award-winning film Parasite may already have some idea of what life in one of these semi-basement apartments can be like. Despite these conditions, Yoon reportedly borrowed $100,000 to pay the security deposit on the luxury apartment for the newlyweds. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. During the week, Yoon would stay in his semi-basement room near work. On weekends, he would visit his wife in Incheon. Occasionally, she was also supposed to visit him during the week. According to the SBS investigation, however, that never happened. Lee never allowed Yoon into the apartment he was paying for. He did not even have a key. Likewise, Lee never visited his room in Suwon while he was alive. The only time she ever entered it was immediately after his funeral. Surveillance footage reportedly shows Lee arriving with Cho and removing every valuable item from the apartment. They never returned. Following Yoon's death, his family made another unexpected discovery. Lee had a daughter named Kim, whom Yoon had legally adopted. As a result, the girl became one of his legal heirs. This meant that assets such as benefits owed by Yoon's employer and the refundable security deposit on the apartment, a common feature of South Korea's rental system, would pass to Kim. Had Yoon not adopted the child, those assets would have been divided between his wife and his parents. Because Kim was now a legal heir, however, the money would effectively be controlled by her mother. Furthermore, Yoon's parents might ultimately become responsible for caring for Kim, and, depending on future legal circumstances, she could potentially have inheritance rights involving their estate as well. After learning all of this, Yoon's family was devastated. They petitioned the court to annul Kim's adoption. However, before rushing to judge Yoon's parents for making such a request, it is important to understand that they believed they had compelling reasons for doing so. After SBS aired its investigative episode, the police were forced to reopen the case. Initially, investigators had concluded that Yoon's death was a tragic accident. Since he had jumped voluntarily and no one had pushed him from the cliff, there appeared to be no evidence of foul play. Moreover, Lee, Cho, and Kwon all told police the same story. They theorized that Yoon's foot had become trapped between rocks immediately after entering the water, preventing him from resurfacing. Later, however, a forensic pathologist made a significant discovery. Foam was found in Yoon's lungs. According to forensic experts, this type of foam forms when water and air repeatedly pass through the airways during the struggle to breathe. In other words, Yoon had fought for his life before he died. He had surfaced for air, gone back underwater, surfaced again, and repeated the cycle several times. If that conclusion was correct, then Lee, Cho, and Kwon had not told the truth. Even accepting Choi's account, that Yoon surfaced after the jump and initially appeared to be fine, did not necessarily prove that anyone had pushed him from the cliff. It remained possible that he had suffered a cramp in the cold water. What it did not explain was Cho's behavior. Why did he swim toward Yoon so slowly? Why didn't he throw him the inflatable tube? Following these discoveries, Lee, Cho, and Kwon became criminal suspects, and investigators began examining their pasts. Had the police conducted a more thorough investigation from the beginning, they might have been astonished by what they eventually uncovered. The first time Lee attracted national attention, she was only 13 years old. She appeared on a television program in which a team of specialists renovated the homes of struggling families, improving both the design and living conditions. Lee came from an extremely poor household. Both of her parents were disabled, relied on wheelchairs, were unable to work, and survived on modest government assistance. Much of the household responsibility fell on Lee. Viewers admired her humility, diligence, and apparent devotion to her parents. During the program, the host asked her what she would wish for if she could have one wish. The question carried no promise that the wish would actually be granted, so she could have asked for anything. Instead, Lee answered that she wished she had her own room because she was a restless sleeper. She tossed and turned, talked in her sleep, and worried that she kept her parents awake. To many viewers, it sounded like an unusually thoughtful and selfless answer for a 13-year-old. She wasn't asking for a room simply for herself. She wanted her parents to be able to sleep peacefully. Lee also said that when she grew up, she hoped to earn enough money to help people who were struggling in life. How did that seemingly kind-hearted child later become a suspect in her husband's death? After details of Lee's later life became public, numerous psychologists and commentators argued online that she had never truly been as self-sacrificing as she appeared on television. Instead, they suggested she had always known exactly what people wanted to hear. 2 years after appearing on the home renovation show, at the age of 15, Lee ran away from home. She dropped out of school and stopped caring for her parents. Instead, she began spending time with older boys who bought her gifts. According to later reports, those relationships gradually became her primary source of income. She eventually entered the sex trade, while Cho, who was 1 year younger than she was, reportedly acted as something resembling her pimp. At 18, Lee unexpectedly returned to her parents' home carrying an infant. She left the baby with them and walked away again. How her disabled parents were expected to raise their granddaughter without adequate financial resources appeared to be of little concern to her. Lee reportedly said that she herself could not afford to support the child financially. Critics, however, pointed out that during this period she was apparently able to spend money on cosmetic surgery, arguing that the issue may have been one of priorities rather than financial inability. She married for the first time in 2010, when she was 19 years old. Her daughter, Kim, was born the following year. Despite the timing, it has never been conclusively established that Lee's first husband was Kim's biological father, as investigators later alleged that Lee had been involved in multiple relationships simultaneously. One reason for that conclusion is that, also in 2010, one of Lee's boyfriends died in a traffic accident. In other words, sometime between her first marriage and the birth of her daughter, she was involved with another man. Little information about that crash has been made public. Lee and her boyfriend were riding in a car when another vehicle struck them. The driver fled the scene. Because the collision occurred on the passenger side, Lee's boyfriend was killed, while Lee survived. She later received an insurance payout. Police never attempted to prove that Lee had orchestrated the accident, and it is entirely possible that she bore no responsibility for what happened. Nevertheless, some later commentators argued that the incident may have shown her how police investigations and insurance claims typically unfolded after fatal accidents. Far more is known about another relationship that also ended in death. Lee later became engaged to another young man and reportedly hoped to marry him. However, because he was still young, he was required to complete South Korea's mandatory military service. Before he enlisted, Lee persuaded him to take one last vacation with her, a kind of honeymoon before the wedding. He paid for the trip. Together they flew to Pattaya. Only Lee returned home. On July 16, 2014, her fiancé died in Thailand. According to Lee's initial account, the couple had been snorkeling to see the coral reefs when he suddenly lost consciousness and died. After returning to South Korea, however, the man's relatives and friends asked her to explain exactly what had happened. This time, Lee reportedly gave a different version of events. She said they had been drinking, gone swimming at night, and that he had been swept away by the waves. The story bore certain similarities to the circumstances surrounding the later death of her husband, Yoon. The fiancé's older brother never believed her explanation and suspected Lee of being responsible for his brother's death. Those suspicions, however, led nowhere. The insurance money was paid to his family rather than to Lee, and, according to publicly available information, she did not receive any financial benefit from his death. Thai authorities quickly ruled the incident an accidental drowning. Some later investigators and commentators would speculate that this case taught Lee an important lesson. If financial gain had been the motive, a legal marriage would need to come before a fatal accident. It should be noted, however, that this interpretation reflects allegations made during the later investigation rather than a judicial finding of fact. The second time Lee attempted to marry was in November 2015, and the circumstances were even more unusual. She became engaged to yet another boyfriend who was deeply in love with her and eager to marry as soon as possible, despite repeated warnings from his friends to slow down. They felt there was something strange about Lee. No one knew much about her background. None of them had ever met her family or longtime friends. The groom dismissed their concerns. The couple began planning a lavish wedding. During the rehearsal, the groom met Lee's relatives and friends for the first time, and immediately noticed that something seemed off. Some of the guests arrived wearing t-shirts and jeans, attire considered highly inappropriate for a traditional Korean wedding. There were other oddities as well. Lee's parents appeared to know almost nothing about her life, while her supposed friends seemed strangely indifferent toward her. Growing suspicious, the groom's parents hired a private investigator. According to later reports, the investigator quickly discovered that every guest attending on the bride's side had been hired as a paid actor. When Lee realized her deception had been exposed, she abandoned the wedding before the ceremony was completed. The failed groom reportedly developed severe depression and anxiety afterward, leaving him afraid to trust or become close to other people. It was not the last time he saw Lee. She later reappeared and claimed that little Kim was his daughter. The man had once been deeply in love with Lee, but not enough to forget basic arithmetic. The dates simply made her claim impossible. Lee disappeared from his life for good. His family subsequently had the marriage annulled. Yet even an annulled wedding could still prove profitable. In South Korea, weddings often include large guest lists, and attendees commonly give cash gifts to the newlyweds. Those gifts frequently cover much of the wedding's cost, and sometimes provide the couple with additional savings. According to reports, one of Lee's weddings brought in approximately $10,000 in cash gifts alone. In May 2016, Lee attempted to marry for a third time. This time, she convinced one of her former boyfriends that little Kim was his biological daughter. She persuaded him that they should marry for the child's sake. The ceremony was held in what appeared, judging from photographs, to be a fast food restaurant or casual cafe. Despite the modest venue, the couple reportedly hired a well-known singer to entertain the guests, a practice that is not uncommon at Korean weddings. Then, during the ceremony, the groom received a phone call from a friend. The caller claimed that Lee was actually his girlfriend, and that they were living together. Shocked, the groom and his family confronted Lee in front of the guests. Humiliated, she fled before the wedding ceremony had ended. That autumn, in 2016, Lee finally married Yoon in Las Vegas. After the wedding, the newlyweds signed the lease for an expensive apartment. Soon afterward, Lee attempted to purchase life insurance, naming herself as the beneficiary. However, the application was reportedly rejected because the marriage had not yet been legally registered in South Korea. As a result, the couple legally registered their marriage in Korea in March 2017. Lee then contacted an insurance agent she already knew, reportedly yet another former boyfriend. With his assistance, she purchased 4 life insurance policies covering Yoon, with a combined payout of roughly $800,000 at the time, approximately $600,000 in today's dollars according to some estimates. The monthly premiums totaled about $700. Maintaining all 4 policies was expensive, and Lee allegedly allowed them to lapse on multiple occasions before reinstating them. Then came another remarkable coincidence. Yoon died only 4 hours before the policies were due to expire. Investigators later concluded that Lee had known exactly when the coverage would end. She had reportedly received a notice warning that if the next premium was not paid before the end of that day, all 4 policies would be canceled. In other words, according to prosecutors, Yoon died while the insurance coverage was still in force. Investigators also questioned why Lee had repeatedly canceled and reinstated the policies. Their theory was that the trip to the Gapyeong River Valley was not the first attempt on Yoon's life. According to prosecutors, the earliest known attempt may have occurred in June 2018, when Lee allegedly punctured one of Yoon's car tires. Yoon noticed the problem before driving far and simply took the vehicle to a repair shop. The second alleged attempt was far more elaborate. One of Japan's most famous delicacies is pufferfish, or fugu. Certain species contain tetrodotoxin, an extremely potent poison capable of causing fatal paralysis if improperly prepared. For this reason, licensed chefs undergo extensive training before they are legally permitted to serve the dish. There is no specific antidote for tetrodotoxin poisoning. Treatment is largely supportive while the toxin clears from the body. On February 25, 2019, several months before Yoon's death, Lee reportedly took him to eat fugu. Prosecutors later alleged that she had somehow obtained pufferfish toxin, possibly through criminal contacts associated with Cho, although the precise source was never publicly established. According to the prosecution, Lee secretly added the toxin to Yoon's food. He became seriously ill, but survived. Investigators later recovered a message allegedly sent by Lee to Cho expressing frustration that the poisoning had failed. The reported message read, "I put so much poison in his food. Why isn't he dead yet?" Prosecutors further alleged that, after this failed poisoning, Lee turned to another method: water. Knowing that Yoon could not swim, she allegedly made repeated attempts to place him in dangerous situations around deep water. According to investigators, she pressured him into riding inflatable water tubes and, on at least one occasion, personally pushed him into the water. Then, in May 2019, about 1 month before Yoon's death, the group went on a fishing trip. They were not fishing from the shore or from a boat, but from a floating fishing platform, a type of cabin built on the water. After dark, prosecutors alleged Lee pushed Yoon into the lake. This attempt also failed. She had apparently misjudged the depth of the water. Instead of falling into deep water, Yoon simply stood up. The water only reached his waist. One obvious question remains. Didn't Yoon realize that his wife had pushed him? According to the account presented by prosecutors, he almost certainly did. Yet by that point, investigators believed he had become so psychologically accustomed to Lee's behavior that he no longer resisted whatever she said or did. Yoon and Lee met approximately 4 years before they married. Yoon told his family that he had met his future wife through work. However, Lee had never worked for the same company, or even in the same industry. Given what investigators later uncovered about Lee's background, some have speculated that the two may have met under different circumstances that Yoon felt uncomfortable discussing with his family. Whatever the case, prosecutors believe that Lee had a clear reason for taking an interest in him. Yoon worked as a research scientist in the laboratory of a major corporation and earned between $60,000 and $70,000 per year at a time when the average annual salary in South Korea was roughly $35,000. He was also exceptionally frugal. By the time he met Lee, he had reportedly saved more than $300,000. Yoon's friends knew how much he earned and were well aware of his substantial savings. That is why they were puzzled when, not long after the wedding, Yoon began asking to borrow the equivalent of only a few dollars, just enough to buy a package of instant ramen and a bottle of water from a nearby convenience store. Eventually, they learned why. According to investigators, every time Yoon received his paycheck, the entire amount was immediately transferred to Lee. The money remained in his account for only seconds before disappearing into hers. Lee controlled all of the family's finances. Yoon's friends became increasingly concerned. They tried to explain that this was not normal. He should have had access to his own money, even if Lee had convinced him that, traditionally, a wife managed the household finances after marriage. They reminded him that modern South Korea no longer followed that custom in the same way. More importantly, they argued, even in families that did follow the tradition, it had never meant that the husband should go hungry while the wife spent freely on designer goods and vacations. When Yoon asked to borrow $3, his friends often sent him much more, perhaps $100. Yoon would quietly return $97. That was simply the kind of person he was. According to those who knew him, he spent the last 2 years of his life living on almost nothing. During the work week, he could at least eat in the company cafeteria. Weekends were far more difficult. He lost a significant amount of weight and often appeared exhausted and malnourished. Lee knew about his condition. According to prosecutors, she showed little concern. Sometimes Yoon would send her photographs of his worn-out shoes or broken eyeglasses, asking if she could buy him a new pair of sneakers because his old ones had fallen apart, and he felt embarrassed wearing them to work. She refused. Investigators alleged that Lee spent his savings, consumed his entire salary, and continually demanded even more, pressuring him to take out loans. Over 5 years, Yoon went from being one of the more financially secure people in his social circle to someone overwhelmed by debt. At first, Lee reportedly offered explanations for why she needed such large amounts of money. She claimed she was caring for her elderly parents. On another occasion, she allegedly told Yoon she had tried to launch an online gambling website, illegal in South Korea, and that she had been cheated and now owed money. Eventually, according to investigators, she stopped offering explanations altogether. She simply demanded everything he earned. She also monitored his spending and required him to ask permission before using his own money, even to pay his rent. In 2018, Yoon filed for personal bankruptcy. By then, his debts reportedly totaled around $120,000. According to prosecutors, Lee remained unmoved. Instead, she continued demanding more. At one point, she allegedly instructed Yoon to hand over his older sister's credit card, which he happened to have with him. The card quickly ended up in Cho's possession. Lee and Cho then went to a gas station and charged more than $5,000 to the card. That amount far exceeded any realistic fuel purchase. Investigators alleged that the transaction was actually a method of converting credit into cash, with the cooperation of the station's owner, who was believed to be another acquaintance of Cho's and allegedly kept a commission for facilitating the scheme. It would be inaccurate, however, to say that Lee never sent Yoon any money. On one occasion, she transferred him approximately $30. The money disappeared almost immediately. An automatic payment for the use of a vehicle was processed the moment it reached his account. According to investigators, the vehicle was driven not by Yoon or even by Lee, but by Cho. As a result, the money existed in Yoon's account only for a matter of seconds before vanishing again. When Yoon decided to get married, he almost certainly imagined a very different life. He could never have expected that his wife would spend his money while maintaining relationships with other men, or that she would speak to him with contempt. Ironically, many details of their relationship became known because Yoon frequently recorded their conversations. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps he hoped to preserve evidence. Perhaps he wanted to understand their arguments afterward. Or perhaps he simply felt so isolated that he found himself replaying his wife's voice despite the way she treated him. Early in the relationship, Yoon seems to have viewed Lee as the kind-hearted 13-year-old girl he had seen on television, a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. He appears to have understood her desire to spend money on herself, to travel, and to enjoy the things she had lacked during childhood. He excused her extravagant spending. Perhaps he believed he could help her heal. He saw goodness in her because he himself was, by all accounts, a generous and compassionate man. According to the prosecution's case, only once did Yoon seriously attempt to leave her. That happened after Lee allegedly assaulted him physically. Even then, she persuaded him to stay. She reportedly told him that she never intentionally hurt the people closest to her, that it simply happened. Then she warned him that he would never be able to get away from her anyway. According to investigators, these cycles of cruelty, remorse, assurance, and intimidation became a defining pattern in Lee's relationships. According to the prosecution, the emotional manipulation in Yoon's marriage became so severe that he eventually saw no way out. Prosecutors argued that Lee gradually conditioned him to accept increasingly irrational demands. They alleged that she repeatedly distorted reality, tested his willingness to accept her version of events, and exploited his desire to care for others above himself. In their view, the process was gradual. Each new demand became slightly more extreme than the last. Each compromise made the next one easier. Over time, prosecutors argued, Yoon became trapped in a reality defined by Lee rather than by his own judgment. Eventually, investigators discovered internet searches that painted a heartbreaking picture of his state of mind. According to evidence presented in court, Yoon searched online for information about selling what is colloquially known in Korean slang as a ghost helicopter, a term referring to human organs and tissues such as kidneys, the liver, the heart, the corneas, tendons, the pancreas, and other transplantable body parts. Prosecutors argued that Yoon hoped to sell his organs to earn additional money for Lee. He had already exhausted his savings. He had taken out loans. From the prosecution's perspective, he believed his own body was the only valuable thing he still possessed. The evidence suggested that he intended to leave Lee with as much money as possible, even after his own death. According to prosecutors, he never had the chance. Before he could act on those plans, Lee allegedly carried out her own. Once investigators began uncovering these details, Lee and Cho reportedly learned that the police were closing in. They disappeared. In early 2022, the pair were placed on Interpol's wanted list. Investigators initially feared they had fled overseas, particularly because Cho was believed to have connections to organized crime. 3 months later, however, detectives received an unexpected tip. Lee and Cho had not left the country at all. They had simply relocated to another city, where they were reportedly spotted socializing with friends. Police arrested both of them. Following their arrests, investigators also detained Kwon, the third man who had been present during Yoon's fatal jump, and charged him with participating in the crime. The prosecution's primary focus, however, remained Lee and Cho. According to investigators, Lee had never intended to evade justice forever. Instead, prosecutors argued that she planned to remain in hiding only long enough to accumulate approximately $300,000, which she hoped to use to hire one of South Korea's most prestigious law firms. During the investigation, prosecutors alleged that Lee had continued working as a high-end escort whose clientele included wealthy and influential individuals. They argued that these experiences had convinced her that almost any legal problem could be overcome with enough money or the right connections. She reportedly believed that if she could secure the country's best attorneys, she would ultimately escape conviction. That plan never materialized. According to prosecutors, Lee excelled at spending money. not saving it. The trial unfolded very differently from what she had hoped. The court heard testimony describing how Yoon had reportedly lived during the final years of his life. Witnesses spoke of a man who was frequently hungry, who wore broken eyeglasses and torn shoes because he could not afford replacements, despite earning a respectable salary. The court also heard allegations regarding the abuse he endured. Prosecutors presented evidence relating to the watermelon incident, the alleged poisoning attempt involving pufferfish toxin, and several alleged attempts to stage fatal accidents involving water. Although psychological manipulation and emotional abuse are often difficult to prove in court, prosecutors argued that the cumulative evidence demonstrated a clear pattern of coercive control. The court ultimately found both Lee and Cho guilty. Lee received a sentence of life imprisonment. Cho was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Even after her conviction, however, Lee continued to attract attention. According to reports, she began corresponding with Cho Ju-bin, the notorious criminal convicted in South Korea for operating a large-scale online sexual blackmail network. After learning of Lee's sentence, Cho reportedly wrote to her in prison, and the two began exchanging letters. Looking back, there is a striking irony to the entire case. According to prosecutors, Lee and Cho might never have become suspects had they not voluntarily approached South Korea's largest television network in an effort to pressure an insurance company into paying Yoon's life insurance. Instead, the publicity prompted journalists to investigate, which in turn led police to reopen the case. What had initially been ruled a tragic accident ultimately became one of South Korea's most widely publicized homicide investigations. According to the prosecution's case, Lee viewed people as instruments to be used rather than individuals to be loved. They argued that she exploited Yoon's compassion to control him, relied on his devotion to keep him close, and ultimately sought to profit from his death. The court accepted that theory, concluding that the evidence established her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.